All right.
All right.
So that is a tough act to follow, but
It is, very much.
we're gonna make this fun. So
Yeah.
let's work.
Well, let me start off by just asking
Yeah.
about your work. Like, how did you come to your position?
Yeah.
For those of us that are trained as architects, we have a very straightforward, rigorous, but it's a formal training. It's a craft, right? There's very little part of that education that talks about the issue of space, race, justice, and design.
Yeah.
So how did you get to
Navigate
that place?
You know, so I am a military brat. I spent time in Trenton, New Jersey growing up, but then I really grew up here in Ohio. I grew up in Dayton, and then I went to Ohio State. There we go, OHIO all day, every day. And so a part of that process was that I wanted to be an architect from a very young age. My father and my mother always had, I always say this, but I don't know that this is the name of the book. I used to have this book called The Encyclopedia of Black Excellence. And my parents were semi-radicals, and we spent a lot of time, when I would get in trouble, instead of being grounded, I would have to read Malcolm X, or I'd have to read all of these things and do book reports to kind of get back. So I had that lens, and I also wanted to be an architect from a very young age, and I spent time, I came here to DAP when I was in 9th grade, and learned that there are very few black people in this profession, meaning that in historically black cities, black and brown cities, we are not represented thoroughly enough. And I'm not worried about diversity necessarily as much as it means a cultural relationship to space. And so ultimately, I took all of that information as I continued to grow through this work and to become an architect. And I ran a few youth education programs for about 10 years, and those programs really focused on how do you translate this idea that diversity is the only thing we're looking for into the idea that justice is the primary focus of our work. And so over that 10 years, we started to develop and organize people across the country to do that work. And then ultimately, 2 years ago, we were able to start a practice that centered itself on design justice, which is really this thing that has existed for 100 years, but really just kind of showed up as a codified form of practice more recently. So that's like a short version of how I got here. Right. And I think ultimately it is it's going to be a continued growth path for me. So what about you? How did you kind of?
See, my path was a little bit different. When I got out of graduate school, I moved to Los Angeles because at that time all the great architects were in LA.
Yeah.
And so I said, that's where they are, that's where I want to go. I want to be a part of that whole scene. And I never forget, I was at a review at SCI-Arc, Southern California Institute of Architects. And for those who know it, it's a very progressive institution. So progressive, in fact, I was watching a student's thesis project, which somehow consisted of 7 or 8 topless women tied with strings. They were like marionettes, and as they moved, the space of the room would change a little bit, right? So there's something about body and space. I mean, I got it.
Yeah. Did you?
Well, I thought it was a little odd, like when it ended, like someone brought her roses, like it was like a fashion show at the end where they're celebrating the person. But someone actually came in right after that and interrupted it, and they said, there's like, hey, everybody's got to go. The city's on fire, right? And that was a civil unrest or riots, depending on your political thing, that happened in Los Angeles. We had to leave. And it was always the contrast between...
Different fires are happening in LA at
different.
the moment.
Yeah, it was the change in like being in that one scene where we're talking about marionettes, puppets, body, space, and then getting on the freeway and seeing all these fires and all these riots, the city just being burned down. And what were they burning down? They were burning down the architecture. They were burning down the space. And that's really what kind of changed me. I said, we have to engage in a different way. I didn't know if architects could, design and make the world better, but I knew that we were certainly making it worse through the environment, through who we were excluding, through even our material choices
Yeah.
and our spatial choices. So that's really how I got
Yeah.
sort of pulled into
Yeah,
it.
and architecture is never neutral, right? So it takes a stance, and it is complicit in larger systems of oppression if we are not thorough about how we think about the spaces and places we put in the world. And so, to that earlier question, right? Like, what does justice look like in public? This is that, kind of typical Cornel West quote. What does it mean for us to actually think about justice through the lens of architecture, through the two kind of positions we've had, right? So the institutional and the practice. What does that look like for you?
Well, one of the things I've always tried to confront is, we should all be better citizens, right? And so the question is, what can I do as an architect? What can I do as a designer? And I think over time I've realized that so much of it has to do with audience and question of who I'm designing for and what are the outcomes that I'm trying to reach. I used to think it was a formal question. It's like, well, as an African American, I'm black, so my architecture is going to look different. It's going to look like it was done by a black man. And now I'm just more about, you really have to involve the people in it. And in some ways, that is the real difference. The way we think about community, the way we think about family, the way we think about home. It's like different from home and house, right?
Yeah.
And really thinking about those things and how they're occupied and used. Now, there are some just basic things. Materials come from someplace. Those have real impacts. Buildings can be more or less accessible. When you order different products, you're actually empowering different kinds of employment. The way you design something talks about the way pieces fit together, and that might mean that they have to work.
Yeah.
So you may privilege labor over material. So those are some of the ways that it manifests in my work.
Yeah.
What about you?
Yeah, so, we have this giant sign in our office that says, for nearly every injustice in the world, there is an architecture that sustains it, right? So there is a way in which architecture has always been complicit in these larger systems. And so for us, I'll take one step back. After, I think about, my trip through 10 years of not knowing very many black architects, through understanding what justice might look like relative to architecture. And then, Mike Brown was murdered, and a series out in Sterling was murdered. And all of these people were harmed in relationship to their authorization in public space.
Right.
And so we always shifted that Cornel West quote to talk about design justice is what love looks like in public spaces, right? Like that is the answer for me, is to think about those conditions. And so we bound all of our work through these kind of core principles of design justice, and started to ask ourselves these kind of 5 principled questions, which is really, where does power lie? So if we can't organize people to understand how power exists across a continuum, whether that's pedagogy, policies, procedures, practice, projects, and people, we oftentimes silo ourselves within one particular mode of operating, which means that we say, if it's not a building and I can't actually make impact just directly by building this one thing, then the rest of it, we are either too big to deal with the small stuff as an architectural profession, or we are too small to really deal with larger social constructs, right? And so we have been hands off, as though the blood is not on our hands. And so it really revolves around those questions. Can we assess and understand how power can be manipulated or dismantled, depending on where you sit? What are the injustices that result from that power? How does it manifest in the physical environment? So what are the physical relics, vestiges of injustice? And then who is directly and disproportionately impacted? We often forget. We try to find ways to assess who we want to work for based on who we think can be the client, not who needs to be served most, right? We have this conversation around homelessness all the time. Well, people want to support the homeless shelter. Great. Homeless shelters need all the love in the world, but guess what? The people who are most disproportionately impacted are the people on the street, right? And so if you're not providing the work through the lens of those who are in that space,
Right.
then you're doing it wrong. Same thing can be said for public housing. Same thing can be said for food deserts. Same thing can be said for prisons and jails.
Yeah, what's interesting is that it actually sort of begs the question in terms of who is the client, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily the person that hires you, but it's the person that you're serving, the person that's most impacted,
Yeah.
by your work.
Yeah.
I had and some people have heard this story before, but when I was teaching at Berkeley, I lived in Oakland, and I was just at a diner on a Sunday morning, and a man comes up to me, and I guess I was dressed pretty shabbily because he offered to buy me some food. And he did. And I said, no, I'm fine,
Yeah.
And I should have let him because I never got any money out of that man for the next 3 years. But it turns out, he was a minister, and he said, I was just over there praying to meet an architect, and I met you, and so we have to come together and do this. So for the next 2.5 years, every Saturday, we worked from 8 o'clock to 12. Every Saturday, just converting this old Butler building warehouse into a church. And the thing that came out of that for me the most was that when we started the project, there were like 13 members in the church. By the time we finished it, there was like 140 something. Right?
Yeah.
And the lesson I took from that was just that it had to do with how we had to build it. Sometimes you need two people to hold something,
Yeah.
right? And just the ability to set up a process in place that was going to force people to work together, to collaborate, to conspire, that is, right, breathe together.
Yeah.
You can do that as a designer.
Yeah.
I mean, that is part of the things that we can participate, contribute.
Yeah.
And it was an interesting project. It's still there. It hasn't fallen down yet.
It's it's amazing because what you're saying is so true, and it speaks to specifically communities of color. We operate in commune. We operate as collective, right? And so often, kind of white supremacist structures force us into these individualized modes of operating. Our single-use housing zoning that exists across the country perpetuates this idea that this lot of land is my own country, and anything that happens on this land I determine, right? As opposed to the fact that we are working together in commune to make our communities, our societies better places. And so if we reframe the ways in which we thought about what it meant to be in community through that type of lens, and it's happened, right? If we think about the Rosenwald schools in the early 20th century, you saw 5,300 local schools built for black kids in the South. 5,000 over 15 years. Now just think about how much space that is.
Yes.
They weren't just schools, they were community centers. They had philanthropic funds, they raised money in community, and they took the little bit of Peasley money that the government gave them to create this massive network of education that supported so many people across the South, right? Like, we do those things in community, and that's exactly what you did in that space.
Yeah. So one of the things I've always been curious, and I alluded to it a bit earlier, is that people will say, so what is it about your work that is different? What is it about it that reflects who you are? Again, based from that lens of we should all be better citizens, how do you bring that to table? How do you deal with the issue of justice in the public realm?
Yeah. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we assess the kind of continuum of power constantly. We need to understand how again, pedagogy, policies, procedures. We always call these the signals and the receivers. These are the things that are sending out the rules, right? The way we are taught sends out the rules for how we're supposed to operate in the world. The way that policies are derived and thought of send out the rules. Procedures, the way that the policies are carried out, those things tell us how we are supposed to operate. And as a practice, as an individual, as a project, we have to respond to those set of rules. And so justice for us looks like decentralizing our work only around projects and thinking about if the solution calls for a policy change, then we actually focus on a policy change.
So, and actually that brings up another question, is that So I think like both of us
Yeah.
have worked both in the kind of public realm,
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
and then also kind of in the private realm, but
Yeah.
basically kind of grassroots up, but also institutional. I've been part of a lot of universities. I've also worked for the city,
Yeah.
so I understand it from both sides.
Yeah.
How do you, when you're on the institutional side, start to talk about
Yeah.
justice in a public space?
Yeah.
On the institutional level, not
Yeah.
on the individual.
I mean, most institutions are so complicated and bureaucratic that you can change small ordinances and procedure very easily. So, for instance, I always talk about the fact that redlining didn't call for an outright abolition of black people in space. It actually called us undesirables. So they tried to shift the language slightly, but the procedure was to say black. And so, like in my role at the city, we were able to start to change the execution of how policies were enacted to support. So, for instance, we hired 16 what we call design advocates, which are just organizers that we had in the city to be a part of a large project called the Claiborne Innovation District. Now, this really isn't done, but the idea of bringing young people and organizers into not just the RFP process, but the flow of designing a project to actually organize, to go out in communities and to knock on doors and to bring people into rooms and to build power. Like that's how we see it. What about you from the institutional side?
Yeah, for me, it was a struggle. When I set up the Civic Arts program in Houston, most people considered it basically a tax. I mean, it was. I had to go around to all the city departments and say, well, we're going to take 2.75% of all your construction budgets, and we're going to spend it on community art.
Yeah.
You can just imagine, particularly in Texas, how that would, go over.
Yeah. But it's created one of the most prolific, pieces. I mean, art systems in general, but one project as well. Yeah.
I know. In the end, it was generating over $21 million a year in art. It had, Mayor Lee Brown, I guess, he was in the Clinton administration, I believe, but he ended up becoming mayor. He was a very big proponent in this, and there was actually a lot of really conservative people in Houston who were also pushing it. They just felt that the city needed more beautiful things, and they did it.
Yeah.
But still, the bureaucracy, getting it through that, always required this rephrasing. Like I said, never called it a tax. I think we called it an allocation, or it was, you were always spinning your way around trying to make it seem like it was something other than what it was, because you couldn't just say, look, there's some percentage of the stuff we're spending should go to make our communities more beautiful.
Yeah. And I have to thank you too, because as the public art administrator in New Orleans for 3 years, we looked at that model for a lot of the work we did. So I appreciate that as well.
Were you able to get it done?
It did not work. We got close, but then I just went off to the side and created my own public art project. So we good, but
that
we
might
ain't
be
good.
the way to do it. No, that just talks about it happened because the mayor really wanted it
to do it
to happen.
Yeah.
So people, they didn't like it, but they got out of the way. Yeah. They just said, okay, we'll let it go through.
Yeah. We also had, I don't know if you know, again, live in New Orleans, we just took down 4 racist white supremacist monuments but of 100. I appreciate that. Yes. So yes, it's a start. We just got a lot more to do.
Out of 100?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
People don't talk about that. Yeah, y'all don't know all that, do you? But it was a fight. It took us 2.5 years, and so the public art, I bound a lot of our public art and civic design work to how we think about public spaces, not just monuments, but how we envision and see ourselves in space, because our communal spaces, again, are the things, it's the fabric that ties us together. So again.
But even when you said, you use the word public art, I wasn't allowed to use the word public art.
Okay.
No, seriously, I had to call it civic art. They said if you use public art, they said it's dead on arrival.
It's dead on arrival.
Because public suggests it was for them, right?
Yeah.
It's for the others. It's for the publics, like public housing. That was just dead on arrival. They said if you said civic art, then they can talk about civic pride, right?
This country, I'm not gonna cuss, but this country.
No, But that's what I'm saying. You really do have to find these ways of negotiating things, and like you're aware of it, and like I said, you just can't say, "Hey, we need more beautiful stuff."
Yeah, and there's something to this, right? Like, in some instances, as organizers, we sometimes use the hammer to bring attention to large issues. As folks who sometimes work in governments, there's a different type of scalpel that needs to be used. And so I think as communities that are moving towards progress, we have to find a way in which we are all working. We are all parts of what progress looks like. So I know, as an organizer and activist in New Orleans, some of us end up siloed, right? Like we end up yelling and being mad at one another because we're not fighting the fight in the same particular way. And so I would implore all of us who are working towards more just, more equitable cities to recognize that we have to move in unison across a bunch of different lanes in order to make justice work.
There's yesterday we talked a lot about 2045. We talked a little bit about what our cities are going to look like. And what do you think? How do you feel about New Orleans moving forward? What do you think it's going to be? Yeah.
That's tough. I mean, we struggle daily with the thought that New Orleans could just not exist by 2045. I mean, I say that in all seriousness. I mean, it's a city that is under siege by climate change, and in a city that has struggled to be resilient after large-scale trauma, right? And so, what does it mean to be able to stand back up and then have to prepare for another blow that is going to be 10 times worse?
Yeah,
right.
It's going to happen.
So I'm not sure what New Orleans looks like. I'm not sure what a lot of the global South, but the South in America actually will look like. But I do know that again, Black and brown people will be on the forefront of whatever happens moving forward. Mostly because we've had to deal with it. I always say this when we see, like, if you see a dystopian movie. There's almost never any Black people in those movies, and I'm like, y'all think y'all gonna be the ones who survive? Is that how you think this is gonna work? It's not. Yeah. It's not how that's gonna play out.
No.
But I think that's the key here, right? Like we've been put in this position for so long. We will find a way to manage it, and I think it's going to be in community. It won't be in this individualized theory of cities moving forward. How do you see it? Yeah.
Well, it's. Well, I could actually speak almost more in New Orleans. But in Cincinnati, I've seen so much incredible change here. I mean, I just came here in 2010, and it is almost unrecognizable. In fact, when I first moved here, I was, because I lived downtown, and I remember I was talking to some friends. I said, this place may have the most intractable poverty I've ever seen. I was like, I was in another panel similar to this, and someone was talking about fears of gentrification, and at that time I was like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
It's like, that is so far from a problem that we need to worry about right now. And in fact, I was arguing, it's like, if sort of white flight and disinvestment was part of the problem, how can that not? It's also going to have to be some part of the solution. I think I was wrong. I mean, in the sense that now I do see it. I do see that gentrification. I do see. It's not so much displacement because it was really abandoned. But still, it's if you live here, it's very hard to find a very easy, affordable place to just get a hot dog. Not a $18 hot dog. You can you can get that here, right? But if you just want to get a hot dog, if you just want a hot dog, it's hard to do. So I think about 2045, and I'm just not sure how this pace can be sustained, and I'm not sure where people can continue to go. And I certainly hope that we don't have the flip, which is starting to happen in some cities, where the poor once used to occupy the inner city, the wealth out in the suburbs. At some point, that's going to switch. But if you want to talk about problem neighborhoods, when the poverty really is running in the suburbs, that's impossible to manage. I mean, they were designed in such a way that
Yeah.
they would be impossible to manage. And speaking about design,
Yeah.
most of these neighborhoods, one way in, one way out, cul-de-sacs, dead end street. They're all the things if you were designing for like, say, you wouldn't,
Ever design.
you wouldn't do it
Yeah.
that way.
I mean, there's no resources, access to grocery, to all these
Infrastructure,
things. Yeah.
all of these things.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
anyway, as
Yeah.
a concluding thought, because I know that we're running out of time,
Okay.
just
Yeah.
give us that one last pearl of wisdom.
Okay, I tell two things. Sorry. One is that we are in a racist system, and that system we have to acknowledge at top. So it means that all of our actions are in some respect driven by that system. So if we're conscious of it, we can actually start to work through it. The second is that we often say that we dislike the kind of term around gentrification, mostly because it is unnuanced in a sense, right? People, cities and communities die of longer processes, and so we need to get there. And so let's figure out a way to think about what displacement looks like and what gentrification looks like and what justice looks like through the lens of equity. So,
All right. Thank you.
thanks.